All right, well, it's time to start. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. My name's Steve Evans. I'm actually not a developer. I'm an IT pro. I work with servers and infrastructure and that type of stuff all day. The point of this talk is I assume everyone here is a web developer or pretty close to it, although I'm always kind of surprised by the percentage that isn't. But assumedly, you're a web developer. You rely on IIS. You probably know a lot about IIS, but I find a lot of times developers have this what I would call Swiss cheese knowledge of IIS, where they know a lot, but then there's these holes in what they're familiar with. So we're going to go through IIS and talk about a lot of the basic stuff, and I think everyone here will at least find one little tidbit to pull out of it. So we're going to start off just by creating a site. So I'm going to switch over to my computer here. So here I'm running, this is Windows 2008 R2, so it's running IIS 7.5, although all of this applies to IIS 7 also. By and large, it's all the same. So here we are in the IIS Manager. We're just going to come down here into the sites, and we're just simply going to right-click and say Add a website. Okay? So the first thing we have to fill out is what are we going to call this site? Now, this is just purely for administrative purposes, but generally speaking, make it a name of something that's easy to remember. Usually, I name it the exact same thing that the users are going to type into the web browser. So we're going to create a site for site1.com, so I'm going to call it very creatively, site1.com. Then we specify a path. So where am I actually going to store the HTML files for this site? And I've pre-created a folder at cinetpub site1.com. So if we went and looked at that folder, we'd see it's just, I have a very fancy website here with a single HTML file. And then we get into the binding information. So the way IIS works is the requests come into IIS, and then IIS has to figure out which website to pass that request off to. And the way it does that is with the binding information. So there's three pieces of information it can key off of. So the first one is the IP address that it came into. So a web server can have multiple IP addresses, and so we can direct traffic to different IP addresses based on, site1.com could be on one IP address, site2.com could be on another IP address, et cetera. One of the problems with relying on the incoming IP address to determine which site the user is trying to get to is, I don't know if you guys have heard, but we're running out of IP addresses. They're getting more expensive all the time. And so we try to avoid having to key off of an IP address. So for now, let's just ignore that. We'll come back to it in a bit. The second thing we can key off of is which port is the site running on. Now, by default, HTTP connection is set to port 80. The reason is that the web browser, when you type in site1.com or whatever it may be, it goes across and it tries to connect to the web server on port 80. So we could change this to something else. We could change it to 81, or sometimes it's changed to 8080. There's nothing that says it has to be on port 80. But you never hear a radio ad where they say, go to our website at mysite.com:82. Users just don't remember that kind of information, right? So we're going to eliminate the port as a possible option on how to differentiate between sites. We're always going to leave that at port 80. And then the last one here is the host name. So what the host name is, this is going to be kind of awkward, so we've got to switch back and forth. What the host name is the web browser in its initial request, in every request to the web server. Here we have on the left side the request to the web server. One of the pieces of information it passes along with what it wants and what type of browser is and that type of stuff, is what did the user type, what's listed up there in the URL bar right now. And so we can see up here, it's highlighted in red. It's, in this case, site1.com. So that piece of information is available to IIS to decide who should get this particular packet. And so that's what we're going to key off of for an HTTP site, generally speaking, is we're going to rely on the host name value to differentiate between our different sites. So we're going to specify site1.com, and we're going to say OK. So now let's open a web browser. And we're going to navigate to site1.com, and this is my beautiful website. Now, it's a well-known secret that I'm mostly in this to pimp my design skills. So if anyone's looking for a designer, let me know. So here we have site1.com. Now, how many people here instinctively type www in front of the website they go to no matter what? Right, so it's a fairly small percentage among technical people. How many people's moms type www no matter what? Exactly. So I'm going to type www, and as a lot of users do, and we're not going to get a page. The reason for that is if we go back to IIS, we look at the sites available, we can see the binding information over here. There's no one that's accepting the requests that are heading to www.site1.com. They're only for site1.com. Wow, that was a nice straight line. So we're going to add an additional binding. So we're going to come down here to site1.com. Over here on the right, we see we can edit our site bindings, along with, like most Microsoft products, there's about 10 other ways to get to this screen. So we're going to add an additional binding. So again, HTTP, all unassigned IP addresses, port 80, to the host name www.site1.com. We come back to our web browser, we refresh, and there's my beautiful page again. All right? Any questions, comments, concerns, personal attacks? All righty. So there we did it with the GUI. One of the great things that's come along with IIS 7.5, so this is specific to IIS 7.5, is strong PowerShell support. So starting with IIS 7.5, we have the ability to manage IIS through PowerShell. So here's the commands we're going to run in a second. PowerShell treats IIS as a drive letter. So just like we have the C drive and the D drive, we also have the IIS drive. And I'll show you in a second how we can navigate through the directory structure of IIS. And then here's just two simple commands on how to create a site. There's a lot of other possible things. You can do anything in PowerShell that you can do through the GUI. So there's two examples that you can look up later when you grab the slide decks. I keep hitting the wrong one. So let's try those out. So I'm going to open up PowerShell here, and I'm going to navigate I'm going to change directories to the IIS directory. And we can see I do a list on that root, and I have my app pools, I have my sites, I have my SSL bindings. Let's drive down into the sites directory. Here's the sites I have. I can keep going even. Here's the actual contents of the site. I could create a file here. I could edit a file here, whatever it is I want to do. So let's go back up to the root. I'm going to pull up my little cheat sheet so you don't have to watch me type. And I'm going to take this command. And it's a really simple command. We're just going to create a new item. And then the location that we're going to create that item. So just how I showed you there's a directory structure, that's where we're going to create the new item, under sites in a site called site2.com. And then we specify binding information. So here we're going to do HTTP connection, any IP address, port 80 on site2.com. I'm sorry, with the host name of site2.com. And then lastly, we specify the physical path. So I'm going to copy that, paste it into PowerShell. Not very well. There we go. And if we go back to IIS Manager, we see there's my site. Okay? And just like we did before, we're going to add a binding, an additional binding for www. Paste that in. If we look at PowerShell, now we have both bindings like you'd expect. And let's go to the website, site2.com, and there we go. Site2.com with an exclamation point this time. I don't know how that happened, to be quite honest. So there we are. We created a site using PowerShell. And so there's all types of great scenarios where you can use PowerShell to automate the deployments of your sites. So now we've done two sites, both with HTTP. The requests are coming in. We're keying off of that host name value on which requests should go to which sites. So now let's talk about how SSL would work. So sorry about that. So SSL, it all starts off with a certificate authority. So the certificate authority, those are the thoughts, the GoDaddies, the VeriSigns of the world. They're the people who, the OSs trust those certificate creators to create SSL certificates for us. So those certificate authorities, they can create certificates that we get as web developers or web administrators or whatever the case may be. So they create a site, and they create it for a specific name. So in this case, it's been created for www.site1.com, and then for a specific date range. So you usually buy a certificate for 1 or 2 years. So the client will connect to the web server, pull down that certificate, and it's going to check for 3 things before the web browser will be happy with it. The first thing it checks for is, was the certificate created by a certificate authority that I trust? So out of the box, Microsoft, Windows ships with a list of certificate authorities. And so generally speaking, you want to buy a certificate from one of those guys, because that way all the computers out there will trust that certificate. The goal there is we don't want to We don't want someone to create a certificate that doesn't verify the identity of the site before they give away that certificate. The second thing they check is, does the host header match? So what's in the URL bar, is it the same thing that the certificate has the name for? So was it created for that particular site or not? If not, it's going to complain. And the last thing it checks is the date on the computer within the range of the date of the certificate? Okay, if all three of those are happy, your laptop gets a green check mark. Okay, so let's create some certificates. So normally what we would do is, back in IIS Manager, we'd go up to the root of the server, and we'd come down here to the Server Certificates module. Okay? Now, it's important to remember, we often think of, okay, we need a certificate for this site, so I'm going to go to the site and create the certificate. You actually create the certificate at the root of the server, and then you go down to the site and assign that certificate. So just keep that in mind. So normally what we do is come over to create certificate request. So we do this. It asks us some questions, like, what's the name of your site? What's the name of your organization? And then that will create a text file. And then you give that text file along with your credit card information to Thought or GoDaddy or whoever it may be. And then they create a certificate and hand it back to you. Obviously, we don't have time right now to do that. So we're going to create a self-signed certificate. So starting in IIS 7, they put this into the GUI, which is really convenient. It used to kind of be a pain. So we're just going to say, create a self-signed certificate. We're going to specify a name for this certificate, which is just purely for administrative purposes. So we're going to call it site1.com. And then it creates me a certificate. Now, if we look at this certificate, we'll see it's been issued to the name of the computer I'm running on here. So it's not really going to be functional for us. It hasn't been created by someone my computer trusts. So the browser is going to complain like crazy, which we'll see in a second. But the encryption process still happens. So if all we care about is causing encryption to happen, or as web developers probably testing that it got moved to an SSL connection at the appropriate times, we have a functional certificate for those purposes. So let's go down to our site and add that HTTPS binding. So go back into bindings, add yet another one, and this time we're going to select HTTPS. Now we notice as soon as we select HTTPS, a couple things change. The first is that we get to select a certificate that's going to be used for this binding. But the other one is the host name has been grayed out. So what's happening is, as that request comes in, the host name value in the HTTP packet is still encrypted. So since it's still encrypted, IIS can't read it until it actually knows which site to assign it to. So that means we can't use the host name value to differentiate sites over an SSL connection. So that's why a lot of times when you go to buy, if you're doing like a shared hosting plan, and they say that you have to also purchase your own IP address to have an SSL certificate, that's why, because they need to bind. The way they differentiate is the incoming IP address. So it's usually an SSL cert per IP address. We'll show an exception to that in a second. So I'm going to select my certificate, say OK, and pull up that site. So we're going to go to HTTPS site1.com. And this is what we get. The web browser, it did those checks. It doesn't trust the person who created it. The names don't match, so it's going to complain. If you were going to your bank, you wouldn't want to do banking with this website, mostly because it's running on my laptop. But if you actually have to read the error message fairly closely to actually know what's going on. But it says this was issued for a different website's address. So that's its complaint. Now, it wants you to leave the website like normal, but we're just going to continue this website. The encryption process is happening. It just wasn't able to verify identity. That's the only thing that is not functioning here. So there's a self-signed certificate. So there's a lot of scenarios where a self-signed certificate is great. There is one way to get around that host name thing, though, and that is to use a wildcard certificate. So if I had multiple sites, let's say I had beta.site2.com and www.site2.com and corporate.site2.com, or whatever the case may be, I can purchase what's called a wildcard certificate. So it will cost a little bit more than a standalone certificate, but if you have a lot of web identities under the same domain, you can buy a wildcard certificate and reuse those over and over again. So let's go through that process. So first thing I'm going to do is remove that binding from site1.com so my demos can continue on. And then we're going to go back up to the root server and go to Server Certificates And I manually created a wildcard certificate using the MakeCert utility in the Windows SDK. I'm not going to get into how to do that right now, but just to give you an idea, it looks like that. So it's not pretty. But ask Google. Go to my website. I have a blog post about it, and you just have to copy and paste accurately, and you'll get what you want. So I pre-created this certificate. So I'm going to import this certificate, select it, try to type my password correctly, which is always easier when a bunch of people aren't watching you. So there's this bug I think I found in IIS where about every 10th time you try to import a certificate, it doesn't work. So there's this workaround, though. So I'm going to open up. It's how many times do you import the same certificate? About 20 times in a week. Only if you're speaking at TechEd, apparently. So I'm going to open up MMC Manager, which we're going to have to do in a second anyways. Now, the Certificate Manager is one of the ones that isn't available under Administrative Tools. You have to manually create a snap-in for it. So we're going to open up MMC. We're going to add remove a snap-in for certificates. And then we're going to, under the computer account, because IIS runs under the computer account. And then we're going to hope that it imports OK this time. So we're going to import the certificate, browse to it. Under all files, there's my wildcard certificate. And you got to be kidding me. Oh, I didn't clear it out that time. Everyone, could you turn around, please, while I do this? No, caps isn't on. I wish. All right, one last try. One more time. OK, I give up. OK, so I'm just going to walk you through it. Let's say I imported that certificate. OK? So one thing I was worried about. You import that certificate, and what you'll be able to do is once you have it in there, you'll have to right-click it and go in here to Properties. The trick is you have to change the friendly name to start with an asterisk, which normally it won't be by default. So right here, it's site1.com. If it was to start with an asterisk, then when I come back here into the IIS Manager and I go under Bindings, when we go to HTTPS, it will have, when we select that certificate, if this was a wildcard certificate, this box would not be grayed out. Okay? And then I can use host names again. And so then I could have this one could be www.site1.com. I could have another site that was beta.site1.com, et cetera, et cetera. All right, sorry about that. Any questions since the demo fell apart? Yeah. Yeah. So the question is, can we use host headers? If you're using a wildcard certificate, for that IP address, you can bind that wildcard certificate to one IP address, and then anything under that domain. So you'll get a wildcard certificate for *yoururl.com. And then you can have anything under that third-level domain name, so beta.yoururl.com, www.yoururl.com, et cetera, et cetera. And you could have an unlimited number. Or you could also have them on multiple IIS boxes. So you could have your beta site over on this server and this one over there. And I mean, these numbers vary by who you get your certificate from and whatnot. But let's say a standard certificate is $100 per certificate, where a wildcard certificate would be like $250. So as long as you use it more than, well, you'd have to use it 3 times to get your money's worth. Realizing those are somewhat completely made up numbers. Any other questions? All right. So I'm going to try my luck one more time at importing that certificate. Anyone want to take a bet on how this goes? Thanks, Daniel. I'm betting against me, so you're going to have to find a fool to bet with me. So I can't. So to clarify, it's the password of the certificate. So when you export a certificate, it wants it forces you to choose a password, so that way not just anyone could import it just by finding the file. There's like 15 people here talking. I'm sorry? OK, yeah, let's create a new one. We got time, maybe. No. You know what? We'll take one stab at creating the certificate, but it's under Microsoft. There's no demo like the one you didn't practice for. SDKs, Windows, version 7, make cert, bin, make cert. Yep. All right, there we go. So where was that? Here's my create wildcard certificate. And where are you, buddy? Oh, yeah. Paste that in. Go back to our certificates. If this works, I'm going to be embarrassed. Well, no, let's be clear. I'm embarrassed anyways. There we go. All right. Whose suggestion was that? No one's going to fess up to that? I got a copy of Windows 7 for you. Come up afterwards. All right, so there I was. I went to Properties. So you notice I added that asterisk. So we're going to go back to site2.com, add this binding. So we're going to add HTTPS. We're going to select that wildcard certificate. Notice as soon as I selected a wildcard certificate, it opens back up the hostname value. So we're going to add www.site2.com. We're going to add an additional one for site2.com. And we're going to create a site, just like we did before, except for beta.site2.com. I already have a folder for that. And we're just going to give it an HTTPS binding only. Now notice they're all using the same IP address. So we're having to key off, well, I'm not, IIS is, having to key off of the host name to be able to get the request to the right box. And let's open up IE. So we're going to go to HTTPS, site2.com. So now notice, we still get this error of, hey, I don't trust this certificate, but it's slightly different. It was not issued by a trusted certificate authority this time, as opposed to the names don't match. So one more little hint or trick, I'm going to take this certificate. It created itself. So I'm going to say I trust this certificate. So I'm going to take this certificate, drag and drop it under Trusted Root Certificate Authority, and hold down the Control key to make that little plus sign appear, to do a copy instead of a move. I'm going to drop that in, and I'll just show you. Here's all the trusted certificates out of the box. And now when I refresh that page, it's happy. The name matches. It trusts the certificate. No other box in the world trusts that certificate, but mine does, and that's all we care about right now. And so the web browser is happy. And then let's go to that beta site real quick, beta.site2.com, and voila, beta.site2.com. All right, cool. That worked out great. Any other questions? So he's asking, how am I getting to site1.com? You know, obviously, site1.com is not registered to go to my laptop. So I use a trick. It's called the host file. So the host file is conveniently located at C Windows System 32 drivers etc. Because that is the most logical place you could possibly put a host file. And then, not only they put it in this random folder, it's not host.txt. It's not host.config. It's just hosts. So every time you try to open it, it asks you, what should I open it with? Because it doesn't remember it. So all the host file does is say, ignore what DNS says. Ignore what normal name resolution says. Go based off of what this says. So you have your IP address and then the names. To the host file? So the IIS, the GUI, is extensible. So you might have a moneymaker there. So the question was, could you build into IIS Manager the ability to edit the host file more conveniently? And it's extensible, so you could conceivably do it. Let me know when you're finished with that project. On your to-do list? Okay. Okay, so where were we? So we did the HTTPS stuff. Okay. So next we're going to look at configuring settings for a website. So let's say we have a website that has a funny homepage. So instead of like default.htm, we got this third-party site from someone. They called it home.htm. So if we go to my web browser now, and we went to site2.com, we would get this 403. what's happening is my browser is saying, hey, I want the default page for this folder. And there is no default page anymore because I renamed it. And so it thinks I want to traverse the directory. And so it's saying, you're not allowed to do that. And so very simple fix. We can just come down here to site2.com. And we can come here to the default document setting. And we can just add home.htm to the list. So home.htm. Basically, when the requests come in, it starts at the top and works its way down until it finds a match. So home.htm, if I refresh the page now, voila, it's working again. All right, so big whoop, right? But what I really wanted to show you is as soon as we made that change, this web.config file got created. If you notice the date on it, that was right now. So starting in IIS 7, certain settings are now stored in the web config file. If there was no web config file for this website, it will create one. If there already is one, because it's an ASP.NET site, for example, it will just insert the settings into the appropriate spot in the namespace. So we see it uses the system.webserver namespace, and then it specifies default document, add the value of home.htm. So I could change this value to home2.htm. If I come back to IIS Manager and do a refresh, it changes there also. Okay, so that's actually where the setting is getting stored. If I decide I really don't want default.htm in the list, I can remove it. If I come back to my web config file, it removes the value and then adds the other value. Okay? So that can be very convenient. There's certain settings that, as an IT pro, maybe I want my developers to have control over that. So in the development process, they can define, what certain settings should be. But it can also be painful because my developers, they're working on stuff. They're messing around with IIS on their box. And that's ending up in the web, they're creating these web config values and they don't even know it. That gets checked into source control, and then I'm breaking the production boxes because we didn't realize this stuff was getting to the web config files. And so we have the option in IIS to change which settings are stored in the web config file versus the IIS metaverse. So let's look at how to do that. It's through a feature called feature delegation. So we'll go back up to the root of the server, and we'll come under here to feature delegation. And this has all the settings available to us. And are they set to read-write, which means the web config file is able to configure that value, and the code is able to read that configuration value. We can set it to read-only, which means the web config file or the code can't set the setting. It can't change the setting, but it's able to read the setting, or not delegated, which means the code, you're not even allowed to programmatically, the website can't even figure out what the setting is by itself. So we're going to change default document to read-only. Now that setting is not going to be stored in the web config file. It's going to be stored in the IIS metaverse. The problem is there's no migration path when you go back and forth. You're responsible for that yourself. So if we went to site2.com right now, so we refresh this page, we get this 500 error. And the reason is we have this configuration section can't be used. If we look at the web config file, what it's saying is, because this is here, I'm not just going to ignore that value because you're not allowed to set it. I'm going to blow up on you also to really make sure you know that you've wronged me. So unfortunately, we have to go back and pull these out. Sadly, it's more common than one would think. Because here's what happens, is in the development process, the developers, they use IIS, and it ends up in the code base, and then it comes across. And so you have to be really careful around this types of stuff. So we're going to remove it. We'll save that web config file. We refresh, and now we go back to our 403 error because the value didn't get migrated over. It just disappeared on us. So now we have to go back to the default document setting. We'll add back the home.htm. And then we notice web config file, it wasn't added there. And if we refresh the page, it's working again. OK, so that wasn't that painful. We just took the setting out. Or we just had to add the setting back, remove it from web config. No big deal, unless you like a reliable website. So now let's say we want to go the other direction. And this is where it gets even, it's not as dangerous, but it creates a really interesting situation. So let's take our default document and change it from read-only back to read-write. So now it should be stored in the web config file. If we go to and look at the value through the GUI, we see that it says that there's a home.htm value and that it's inherited. If we look up at the root where it's inheriting from, it's not there. There's no home.htm there. So that was a lie. It's not inheriting home.htm. And if we go to web config, it's not there. And so this setting is just kind of coming out of thin air. I have to imagine at some point in time it would stop working, or at the very least, it's going to create all kinds of confusion. So if you're ever going to go from being read-only back to read-write, you should come into that setting, revert to parent. So that just says, ignore everything we have, just go back to just inherit only. And then add that value back so it ends up in the web config file again. So there it is, and now we have a functional site again. Okay? So admittedly, changing between delegated and not delegated is rare enough that it's not that bad, but it is just something you got to stay on top of. I think the more interesting thing, the point I was really trying to put across, is that you have the ability to control which settings are in web config and which ones aren't. And if you have an IT department, if you don't manage the web server yourself, go have that discussion of where does it make sense for the developers to be setting stuff, and where does it make sense to keep that stuff out of the code base and let IT manage that type of stuff. So now let's talk about application pools for a second. So the application pools, that's where your code is actually running. Think of it as if you were using Office or Microsoft Word, and you open up a Word document, you work on it for a bit, you save the file, you close it, you open back up. That's Word, that's your application pool. That's where the work is happening. So as you see here, we have several app pools. When you create one through the GUI, it creates one just for that site itself. And so we can double click on it. We have the basic settings. And so you get to choose which version of the framework. And is the managed pipeline, is it going to be integrated or classic? Now, we could have a really long discussion about the differences between integrated and classic. But just to sum it up, in integrated mode, ASP.NET is part of the pipeline. In classic mode, ASP.NET is bolted onto the side of the pipeline. That's really all you need to know. You want to be in integrated mode whenever you possibly can. If something's breaking and it works in classic mode, work on making it so it will work in integrated mode eventually. Okay? I migrated a site that is in classic ASP. The code base is about 10 years old, and it ran just fine in integrated mode. So it often works. And if you really want to find out the details, like what the differences are, there's tons of information out there. We just don't have time to dive into all of that today. I'm sorry. Blah, 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 blah client. Oh, the framework version? Oh, so this is just which version of ASP.NET the site's going to run. So the question was, what is this dropdown about? So that application pool, if it's set to .NET 4, it's going to use the .NET Framework 4. If it's set to .NET 2, it's going to use version 2. And if it's no managed code, it won't use the .NET Framework at all. So, yes?
I understood that .NET 2 applications can run under the .NET 4 application.
So the question is, can you run a .NET 4 ASP.NET site under a .NET 2 application pool? Oh, other way around? I believe I've heard that also. I got to be honest, I'm not exactly sure. And I'm not exactly sure what the advantage of doing that would be, if there is any, or if it was just to keep things from breaking. I think that was mostly done so that people who only have the .NET 4 framework wouldn't have to go download the .NET 2 framework, so that they can eventually drop those frameworks off. But I'm not 100% sure. Was there another question that I missed? Okay, sorry. So there's the basic settings. And let's dive into the advanced settings for a bit. So some of the more interesting ones, we're not going to go through all of them, but the first kind of interesting one is enable 32-bit applications. So you kind of have to think about this one for a second. Enable 32-bit applications false. So this is going to compile with 64-bit DLLs. Whereas if it was true, it would compile to 32-bit DLLs. So there's a lot of argument about which one would be better. You really just have to stick with, if you have 32-bit dependencies, you're going to have to set this to true. Otherwise, it doesn't matter as much, although the big advantage of going to a 64-bit application pool is your website can address more than 4 gigs of memory. If your website needs more than 4 gigs of active memory, we probably need to start scaling out our websites and do like a web farm scenario. if you do have a website that legitimately using more than 4 gigs of RAM, give me a call because I'd love to work on that project. So enable 32-bit applications or not. There's some stuff here about CPU, so we can limit, say you only use this CPU or only use that CPU. Yeah. Yeah, there's a great talk tomorrow by Richard Campbell. It's scaling ASP.NET websites. He's going to be much better positioned to answer the details of that question. So I would recommend everyone here goes to that session, regardless if you're interested in that particular question or not. But it will be a great session. But ask him that. He'll answer it much better than I will. So here's some stuff about idle timeout. So this is an interesting one. This is saying if nothing hits my website for 20 minutes, shut down the application pool. Now, if I have a production site, I don't want that first user after that 20-minute wait to go through the expense of firing up the application pool, going through the onload events, creating those SQL connections, et cetera. So normally we change this to 0 on a production site, meaning even if I go an hour without a user, keep the application pools up because my server's not doing anything else, apparently. The ping-enabled stuff. So the application pool is responsible for checking the health of the application, of your website. So it queries the application pool on a regular basis to determine is the website still healthy or not. If it's not healthy, it will just recycle it. If it believes that something's wrong, it will cause that application pool to recycle, which is basically the same as closing Word and opening Word back up and reopening your document. So ping enabled true, it's going to check every 90 seconds. I'm sorry, it's going to wait 90 seconds. If it doesn't respond, it's going to check every 30 seconds. Scrolling down a bit. Down here, the recycling stuff, this is kind of interesting. So every 1,740 minutes, which obviously is 29 hours. The first few times I did this demo, I said it was 25 hours. And I got really embarrassed one day when someone actually did the math. But it was amazing how many times I was able to say it was 25 hours before someone called me on it. So every 29 hours, the application pool is going to recycle no matter what, even if things are working great. And it's just going to, just kind of give it a fresh start. It's like rebooting your Windows 98 box every night just to get that fresh start in the morning. So let's say you don't want that for some reason. Because when the app pool recycles, you lose your session state if it's stored in process. There are some consequences to an application pool recycle. So if you weren't interested in that, you only want it to happen, say, at 2 a.m., you could set this to 0 and come here under specific times and specify, OK, I want an application pool to recycle to happen at 2 a.m. every day. So if you know that no one's using your site at 2 a.m., maybe you want to control that setting a little more finely. I would say, though, in general, you should have the goal of not caring if the application pools recycle. You should design your website and the way you store session state and whatnot so that when application pools recycle, your users aren't affected by that experience. Yeah? On the what thing? Oh, OK. Oh, so he's saying that if you're doing development and you've attached to the IIS process and you're debugging it, if that health check comes in, and it's just Visual Studio sitting there waiting for you to say F10, it's going to kill the app pool. Yes, that's true. Yes. Shared hosting? Oh, so he's saying in a shared hosting environment, the app pool recycling is a problem. It's really not the shared hosting environment. It's that the session state is stored in process. So you have 3 options in storing session state. You can do in process, you can do the ASP.NET State Service, or you can do in SQL, or you can do custom. So in a shared hosting environment, it's in process, which means it's inside the app pool. So when the app pool recycles, it throws all that stuff in memory away. If it's stored out of process, regardless if it's shared hosting or internal app or whatever, that's where the session state's stored somewhere other than the app pool. And when the recycle happens, the session state doesn't get thrown away with it. All right. So there's app pools. So I know no one here has ever written code that would require this step, but I'm sure all you have people who worked in your company before you who created code that's not good. It crashes. It causes problems. One of the cool things we can do with app pools is take that area of the site. So if we have like a specific folder that the guy before you developed, not you, of course, we can take that part of the site and shove it off in its own app pool. It's not going to solve the problems with that code, but it's going to put it off in its own little sandbox so that it can only hurt itself. So what we're going to do, we're going to create an additional app pool right now. We're going to call it Stupid Code from Last Guy. And then we're going to come down here to site2.com, and we're going to take, let's say it's this auth folder I have, that there's something in there that causes problems, and it affects the rest of the site. Maybe it's crashing, so it causes the app pool to recycle, which causes the entire site's app pool to recycle. Maybe it causes some blocking, so other good pages are getting blocked up behind it. So we can just right-click this guy, say Convert to Application, and then it will allow us to select a different app pool than the rest of the site is running on. So I'm going to select Stupid Code from Last Guy. And now this part of the site, you notice the icon changed a little bit there. This part of the site is running in its own application pool. I had a client where they were doing some COM interop stuff in ASP, and it was causing blocking. And certain pages would get stuck behind it. And we determined it was one particular page that was really the problematic page. So we stuck it in its own folder, gave it its own app pool. And that page continued to block, but it didn't affect the rest of the site. So all the other pages in the site ran, well, I won't say okay, but they weren't as bad as that one. It was a client going through some growing pains. So, yes, in the back.
What implications does that have for session state?
So that is a good point. So the question was, what implications does that have for session state? It will have its two separate session states at that point. So if you're storing session state in process, you're going to be disjointed. This particular client I was talking about, they were storing session state out of process. So all the session state was in a central location, so it didn't matter for them. OK, so now that we're talking about problematic pages, let's talk about how we can identify what problematic pages are. So I'm going to open up IE, and I'm going to go to localhost/slow.aspx. And what this is on the onload event, it sleeps for like 5 minutes. So it's going to sit here and churn forever and ever. So let's go back to IIS Manager. If we go up to the root, we have a module here called Worker Processes. So Worker Processes is going to show us all the running app pools underneath it. And I'm going to go into the My Site app pool, and there's that page. See, there's my request right there. And so I can watch even the timer over here on the right keeps incrementing as time goes on. So on a real production web server, you can see, which pages are taking longer to run, which pages are getting stuck behind other ones. And so this can be pretty useful. Now, for those of us who have better things to do than sit here and watch this console all day, we have another option. So we have something called failed request tracing. So I'm going to drill down here to mysite.com, and we're going to come in here to the failed request tracing rules, which you'll often hear referred to as FRT. And we're going to add an additional rule, so we can specify, what types of pages do we want to create these reports on. We could even say, any page that has login in the name. We could do any type of custom search like that. But I'm just going to choose all content. And then I can do it based off of status code. Or I had a particular client, we did every page that took longer than 30 seconds. So it was a quick way to find those long-running pages and figure out what was going on with them. But for this, I'm just going to look at status code of 500s. So anytime a page throws a 500, create one of these FRTs. And then what kind of information do we want to collect? Say finish. And then I'm going to go to this page that's localhost/fail.aspx. And so I was able to get .NET to divide by 0, which was a lot harder than I thought it would be. They really try to keep you from doing that. So this threw a 500 error, right? So back to IIS Manager. If we come in here to edit site tracing, now one of the things to watch out for is make sure this checkbox is set to enable. Otherwise, it's not going to collect these reports. But because it threw that error, it generated an FRT in the particular folder. And here it is. We can see it was just created. And it comes up. It has a plethora of information. And yes, I learned the word plethora from that Chevy Chase movie, The Three Amigos. So we can look through this, all kinds of information. Now, this was a very simple page, so there's not a lot of information to glean from this one. It was just I divided by 0. But it goes all the way through, any type of tracing you're doing. We can come down here to compact view and even see the HTML that was spit back to the user. So here's the actual HTML from that yellow screen of death that it just pulled up. So this can be super helpful. I had a client that they were running into some problems. I generated one of these. I handed it off to development, and they're like, oh, that's the problem? They knew the exact method that was being called that was blowing up on them. I'm sorry? So the question is how large do these log files get? And I'll expand on the question and say what kind of performance hit would creating these FRTs create? So how large they get, I guess in theory they could get significantly larger. This one here, it's generating FRTs of 278K. And like a production, more of a real web page, I've seen ones that are a meg, 500K to a meg. So nothing ridiculous. You'll also notice back on the setting, when we configure FRT for the site, we can specify how many we want to keep. So by default, it only keeps the last 50. So then the second part of that question was what's the performance impact? Well, by the time we've had that 500 error, we have all the information, and so it has to create the XML file. So is there a performance impact of creating that XML file? Yeah, absolutely. I've never seen it actually affect real-world performance of a box though. I'd be shocked. Now, if you configured it to create an FRT for every single request, then you would probably start to see some issues. But as long as you scope it narrow enough, it's not going to be something to worry about. Yes? Yeah, so the question is what happens once you've reached that 50? Once the 51st one will delete the first one, and so on. So it will just roll. OK. So that's great if you're looking for a specific type of event to happen. But let's just say I have my IIS logs. I want to do some analysis of them. So we're going to turn to Log Parser for that. The Log Parser is a free tool from Microsoft that, among other things, it can do a SQL-like query against my IIS logs. And I'm going to use a third-party tool called Log Parser Lizard that's just a GUI that's wrapped around Log Parser. So here I'm opening up Log Parser Lizard. I'm going to do a new query. And while we're waiting for that, we're going to pull up and find where my logs are. So it's CINET-pub logs, log files. And I want to do it on this third one here. So I'm going to copy this path. So we're going to do select star from, actually I'm going to do select top 10 star from that location star.log. So it's going to pull back 10 records for me. So here's the information that are available in my logs. So I have when it happened, what was the client's IP address, what was the URL, what type of browser, et cetera. So let's say I wanted to find out what are my most common 404s. So let's do that. Now, I bet you everyone in this room is better at SQL than me. So please forgive me as I make a mockery of it. But we're going to search for the CS URI stem and then the count where we only care about, the SC status. There's our SC status. We only care about SC status equals 404. And then we're going to group it by the stem of the URL. And we're going to run that guy. And we see that the fave icon was the problem 100, return 404s 119 times. Now, on a real production website, this is always really, really interesting. I guarantee you that if you ran this on your production website, you would find some little icon image that your page is still referencing and you just don't realize it. So you'll probably find 10 to 100 URLs that are getting hit that you could fix. And then there's all kinds of other stuff you can do with Log Parser. You can look at how many megabytes per hour my website's producing. And so that can be really useful for bandwidth planning purposes. How many users are getting 404s that are using Chrome? And all types of analytics like that can be really helpful for various reasons. Any questions on Log Parser? Yes? So the Log Parser tool itself is a free tool from Microsoft. I don't believe it's open source, but I'm really not sure. The log parser lizard is just a GUI wrapper around log parser itself. Log parser is a command line tool. Log parser lizard, I'm not 100% sure. There's basically a free version and then one you can pay for. The one you pay for, you get more stuff. I've always been happy with the free one myself. No one here works for log parser lizard, right? Yes? So what you can do, I know that with log parser, you can use log parser to dump the logs into SQL. And then you also do have the option through the advanced logging extension, and we'll talk about extensions a bit. You do have the option of using a SQL backend to shove your IIS log information. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you have a dependency on SQL, and et cetera, et cetera. The logs work great. Like the text file logs, they work great. So generally speaking, unless you're doing something really, really complex, you're going to be just fine from a performance standpoint. I mean, this is running on a little VM, 1 CPU, a gig of RAM, and I can do some pretty somewhat intense things. There was a question farther back? Oh, cool. I must have already answered it. OK, let's move along. Let's talk about website deployment for a bit. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio. So this started, what we're going to talk about here started with Visual Studio 2010. So it has a couple different names, or it's known by a couple different names. One of them is one-click deploy. It's also known as MS Deploy. I hear a lot of people calling it Web Deploy. But what it is instead of using FTP or some other way to upload your website, this will use the MS Deploy service, which runs through IIS over port 80, to allow you to push your website up to your web server, along with a bunch of other stuff. But let's just start with the Visual Studio example. So here I am. Now I'm going to run this on the box I'm actually sitting on, so it's not quite as impressive, but it's the same idea. So here's my site on the local file system. So I have this web config file we changed when we created the FRT report. And we also have this static file. I'm going to delete the static file. And then we're just going to right-click our site and say we want to publish it. Now we specify the publish method is web deploy, which is also called one-click publishing, which is also called web deploy. I'm sorry, MS deploy. And then where the service URL is, so it's on my local box, but this will often be the URL that specifies your specific web server over at GoDaddy or wherever, Azure, wherever the case may be. And then what the name of the site that you're going to push this site to, which IIS site. So we're going to publish that. And we see in the output, it updated the web config file, and it added the static.html file. So it went across. It said, hey, here's what I have. What do you have? It figured out the differences. It pushed the changes up. If there was an additional file over there, it could have pulled it off. It could have deleted that file. So we could keep things exactly in sync. So that's really nice if you want to publish from Visual Studio. So that works well for a very small team. But let's say we're doing deployment stuff out of TFS or another type of build server. So we can do the exact same thing from the command line. So I'm going to go to C program files /IIS Microsoft Web Deploy. And the executable is MS Deploy. So I just run it without arguments, and I'll get a plethora. I use that word again. I'm stuck on it now. I get a ton of information about various options I have. So I'm just going to real quick do a MS Deploy. I'm going to do a verb : sync. So that means I'm going to specify a source and a destination. I want them to sync it up. My source is going to be the web server. So the source is IIS itself, along with all its subsites. And the destination is the web server at computer name. So that's a comma in there. Computer name equals, and then the name or the URL that I want to send, that I'm going to send this information to on the other side. So demo-IIS01. And then I'm going to throw a -what-if in there. So that's just like in PowerShell. It means just tell me what would have happened if we would have actually done it, but don't actually do anything. So we're going to run that. It's going to go over and connect, and here's everything it was going to change. And so that actually would have picked up the IIS config I have on this box and carried it over to the other box and would have had complete exact matches. Imagine this scenario where you have a web farm and you want to keep them in sync. This is the perfect way to do it. Have a staging box, get everything there. If you need to change an IIS setting, you can change it there. And then you can just distribute it out to your web farm programmatically. Yes?
Is there a way to limit which files go and which don't?
Yeah, so there's all types of options. You can exclude a certain path, exclude a certain file. There was actually a session this morning by Jeffrey Palermo, which you can go catch the video of, that gets into this a lot more detail. This is very high level. Okay. I'm sorry? Jeffrey Palermo. It was at like 10 a.m. this morning-ish, before I was awake. I was awake, but I'm on the West Coast time. OK, there's MS Deploy. So let's talk for a bit. Let me switch back over to this guy. Let's talk a bit about how do we secure IIS. So I think everyone remembers the Windows 2000 IIS 5 days where it was dangerous to put an IIS box on the internet, right? Everyone here, well, hopefully not all of us have erased the idea of code red from our memories. I've tried to, because it was a painful era for IT pros. But here's a screenshot out of Windows 2000, the setup screen. You won't believe what I went through to get you guys this screenshot, by the way, so I hope you appreciate it. So this was the default installation of IIS 5. So if I was going to set up a file server, by default, it had IIS on it. And then to make it even better, it included all this very helpful stuff for me. And there was actually a bug in one of those files in there that is what allowed code red to attack the systems. And so then they came out with the URL scan, which looked at the URLs before they passed it off to IIS. And we were all concerned that it was going to be a performance issue. Turns out that you end up throwing away so many malformed URLs that it actually improved the performance of our boxes, because URL scan was taking care of it before IIS had to. So then in IIS 6, or Windows 2003, that's when they did that big security initiative. So they started, it wasn't installed by default, so that was a huge help. All of a sudden, IIS was only found on web servers. And then the other thing they did was there was no default scripts, there was no sample type stuff. And they added this configuration where you had to specify what types of files, what types of web pages you would allow to run. So if I wanted to allow ASP.NET pages to run, I'd have to go explicitly allow it. So that was a huge step forward. Then IIS 7 and IIS 7.5 came along, and they took it even a step further. So it's not installed by default. There's no sample content. URL scan comes. It's just built into IIS. It's not even really URL scan anymore. And you don't just specify what types of things are allowed to run and which ones aren't. You specify which specific components of IIS you want to allow to install. So you can see in this screenshot, I've installed the ASP.NET runtime, but I have not installed the ASP runtime. So I could put an ASP file on my server, and it just will not run. The bits that turn an ASP page into a web page don't exist. And the great thing about that is, let's say there was a really bad vulnerability in the ASP engine that comes out tomorrow. It doesn't affect my box. I don't have the bits on the server for it to be exploited. So when people ask me, how do I secure IIS 7? All you need to do is only install what you need. And just out of the box, it's secure by default. So it's really, really convenient from that perspective. One of the other great things about IIS 7 is all of these little checkboxes here that came on the CD. You can also get extensions that came out after they printed the CD. So one of the most popular ones is URL rewrite. And there's a bunch of others. But it's become really hard to keep track of what's the latest version of URL rewrite. What's the latest version of the MVC, of MVC? How do I get the tools update for MVC? And so Microsoft has this great tool called the Web Platform Installer. So it's a free tool from Microsoft. Think of it as the App Store for IIS, or the Windows Phone 7 marketplace for IIS, if that's more your cup of tea. So what it is a gallery of extensions and web applications that are available for you to install on your IIS box. The one big requirement to be in this app store, the Web Platform Installer catalog, is it has to be free. Outside of that, I don't think there's a ton of requirements. So we can go through. There's the Spotlight app. So right now they're spotlighting Web Matrix. But we can come here under Products, and we can see SQL Server Compact 4, Web Farm Framework, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you. No, thank you. So we can come through here. We can say, here's what we want. It's only showing us the latest versions. And so it makes it a lot easier to stay on top of the fast-paced environment of all this stuff that's coming out. We say install. It figures out what the dependency are, and it downloads and installs that stuff for us. Like I was saying, one of the most popular extensions that's come out for IIS is the URL rewrite. So what URL rewrite does is allows us to write rules to change the request coming in and going out on the fly. So let's go through a few of them. So we're coming here to site2.com. We're coming under here to the URL rewrite extension. So the first thing we're going to do is add a rule. So it comes with a bunch of pre-canned rules, and we're going to do a blank rule from scratch at the end, where we create we're just going to say, what URL format do we want to stick with? Do we want to go to site2.com, or do we want it to be www.site2.com? So we're going to choose canonical domain name, and we're just going to say, we want www.site2.com to be our primary format. So we say OK. It creates this rule. If we pull up IE, so now if I go to site2.com, it's going to automatically redirect me to www.site2.com. OK? So let's go to HTTPS site2.com. Unfortunately, it redirects us to HTTP www.site2.com. So let's look at how to fix that. So first, we're going to open up our existing rule. And we see that it's going to match on the pattern of anything. And then whenever the HTTP host does not match the pattern, www.site2.com. And when that's the case, it's going to redirect to http/www.site2.com. So we're going to make a small change to this. Now, URL rewrite rules are like ways you could program a solution. There's all kinds of ways we could have solved this problem. We're going to add a condition where we ask the server variable HTTPS doesn't match the pattern of off. Okay? So now it has to be HTTP traffic. And then we're going to create an additional rule for exact same type of rule, www.site2.com. But this time we're going to add a condition where HTTPS is equal to on, and then redirect to HTTPS. So now, when I go to HTTP site2.com, still sends me to the right place. When I go to HTTPS site2.com, now it keeps me on the SSL connection. Okay? But we have these really ugly names for the rules. Canonical hostname rule 2 and the canonical hostname rule 1, which I really don't like, because then I have to remember what this stuff is or go figure it out. So let's go back to our web config file, and let's just rename them. So add www to HTTPS, and add www to HTTP. Save that file, refresh it, and now we have pretty names again. Okay? Let's do another one. So I have a page here, localhost product.aspx, ID equals hello, TechEd. Okay? I'm sure everyone can imagine what this code looks like. You know, I look at the query string, I pull out that value, I put it on a label. I assign it to a label. But this URL is ugly, right? No one really would ever really want to type that in. So let's create a URL rewrite rule to make that look prettier. So come up to this site, go under URL rewrite, add a rule, the user-friendly URL. So I give it my URL format, and then it asks me, how do you want to rewrite that URL? So we'll drop it down. I'm going to choose localhost/product/product ID. So now, if we come back here to IE, I can go to localhost/product/fixed. And there we go. So what's happening is the request comes into to IIS, and then URL rewrite rewrites that rule under the covers and passes it off to your web page as the old style format. So your code doesn't have to change, because it sees the same things it's always been seeing. But the user gets to see the pretty URL. And so there's all types of advantages for that. It's easier to type in. It's better for SEO reasons, et cetera, et cetera. And then let's do one more. Back here on site2.com, I want to create a rule that when anyone goes to the login page, it will redirect it to an SSL connection. Okay, so I will force any login type traffic to go over SSL. So I'm going to add a rule, and this time we have to create a blank rule. And so we give a name for the rule, so we're going to go HTTP to HTTPS. And it's going to match on the pattern when login.htm. So we can come here and we can test the pattern. So if we were to go to test.html, it would not match on that. If we went to login.htm, it does match. Okay? And now this is regex, so you can get really crazy on what you put in here. This one obviously is quite simple. And then our action is going to be, we're not going to rewrite, we're going to redirect to HTTPS, www.site2.com, and then the rest of the URL string. Okay, that's what that R:0 means. Now, there's one other thing we have to do before we use this. Now, imagine I go to http site2.com/login.htm. It redirects me to https site2.com/login.htm. Then it goes through the URL rewrite rule again, and it matches. It matches my condition, login.htm. So now it redirects to https login.htm over and over again. So we create this infinite loop. So to avoid that, we add a condition of when the server variable is HTTPS, only when it's off. So we only care about this when the traffic's over HTTP. If it's over HTTPS already, problem solved. We can skip the rule. So we're going to apply that. And now we can go to site2.com/login.htm, and we see that we got redirected to the SSL site. So that way we know that our traffic's secure. Any questions about URL rewrite? Yes? Oh, so could I set that at the server level instead of for each site? You probably could. It would be a little bit more complicated because you'd have to grab all the different variables. You couldn't use the pre-canned rule. You'd have to create your own, that's for sure. Because if we look at that rule, it's if we look at the rule, it's just doing a simple redirect. You know, the site2.com is hard-coded in there. So we'd have to do all that programmatically. It wouldn't be impossible. No, you could. You absolutely could. You can do just about anything you want with URL rewrite. It's how much effort you're willing to put into it. And then I'd also have the concern of how manageable that is, just from an IT perspective. But we'd have to do a lot of talk about the requirements there. Yeah.
Would it work the same if login.html is the default page?
Would it be the same if login.html is home page?
Is it default?
Oh, so if it was the default doc?
Yes, and you don't type it.
No, it wouldn't match then, because it's not part of the URL. So the question was, if the login.html file was the default doc, so all you really see is site2.com, URL rewrite's not going to match on that because it's not in the URL string. Any other questions? I want to talk about IIS Express. OK, we got 7.5 minutes for IIS Express. Awesome, that's perfect. OK, so IIS, here we've been talking about IIS proper. This is the real IIS. One of the problems, as I'm sure you're all aware, with Visual Studio is it came with that Cassini web server, right? That little default built-in one, which is like IIS, and it's also not like IIS. Like, it's in this no man's land of functionality. So one of the things that's been released recently is IIS Express. So it's true IIS, except it doesn't run as a service on your server. It runs as an application under your user context on anything Windows XP and up. So I've installed IIS Express on this box. I'm going to open up Visual Studio. I'm going to create a new website. So new website, I'm just going to create one of these default ASP.NET websites. So I'm going to say OK. So I have this beautiful website now. And one of the things, so what I'm going to do is I want to change, instead of default.aspx being the default page, I want about.aspx to be the default page. Because I think about.aspx is a better looking page. I actually kind of do. But that's because I've done this demo too many times. So we're going to come down here. We notice the web config file still has that system.webserver, just like we do in real IIS. So we're going to add those rules that we saw earlier. I have a cheat sheet here. We're going to add these default document rules like we had earlier. So there we go. So now the default document should be about.aspx. So I'm going to launch this site. If we notice over here in the corner, it's the old guy. It's the Cassini still. And if we look at what page pulled up, default.aspx still pulled up. That's because Cassini knows nothing about these system.webserver settings. It completely ignores them. So the solution is we can right-click this site and select Use IIS Express. And this is going to convert this site from using Cassini to IIS Express. So now when we launch this page, we see that it pulls up the About page. So now that we're using IIS Express, it knows about the system.web server in the config file, and we're able to give it those settings just like we do in IIS proper. IIS Express also comes with URL rewrite. So I'm going to take, back to my cheat sheet, I'm going to take this rule, and what it does is when we go to name of the site / contact, it's going to redirect us to this test page. So not a really exciting URL rewrite example, but I just want to show that the URL rewrite functionality is available in IIS Express, where it's not in Cassini. So we see the random port number we picked was 8305, so we're going to plug that in there, 8305. And we're going to add a static HTML file of test.html, give it a little bit of content. This is the test page. And now, when I go to whatever / contact, we get redirected to that test page. Okay? So not really exciting demo from the aspects of what can URL rewrite do, but we now see that URL rewrite's available in IIS Express. We don't have to install IIS Express on our development machines and deal with all the difficulties that go around that just to get some URL rewrite functionality. It also, if we go into our My Docs folder, we see we have this folder, IIS Express. And in there we have trace files. So every single request that goes through IIS Express, it creates a FRT report for it, just like we could do for in real IIS. And we also have the logging just like we do in real IIS. So I can take log parser, run it against against these log files right here, and get the information I needed. So one of the things is IIS Express with Visual Studio, by default, it picks this random port. Sometimes that's just fine. Sometimes going to localhost / random port is just fine. If you can bind it to a specific port, and you can even do SSL stuff to port 443. So in Visual Studio, we can go to the properties of this project, and we can see SSL enabled, true. And that will set up SSL on a different port than 443. But you can go into your config file and specify, hey, use port 443. If you're interested in doing that, a great resource is Scott Hanselman's blog. He has a great post about it. And then also, if you were at his web platform talk yesterday, he should have done that demo. So you can either catch it in the video or you can catch it in the mix video. Any questions? Yes? So Cassini is still in Visual Studio. How long it will remain in Visual Studio, I don't know. If I was a betting man, I would say that the next version of Visual Studio will just have IIS Express as the default. But I have no inside knowledge on that. Yes? Yes. I'm pretty sure. I'm not 100% sure on that, though. Yes? No, go ahead. Yeah. So the question is, what was the GUI I used around the log parser? And it was called log parser lizard. If you just do a search for log parser GUI, you'll get a bunch of different options. So before everyone leaves, if we could make sure, and by we I mean the people who attended, if we could make sure to fill out the demos, I'm sorry, not the demos, the evals. The evals are really important to us as presenters. So if you could just make sure you take the time to do that, we'd really appreciate it. Like I said, you should go to Richard Campbell's talk tomorrow about ASP.NET performance. And then there was the two other talks I referenced about the web deploy and the web platform ones that were really relevant to this type of stuff. And then here's some obligatory slides. And thank you for coming.